Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Josh Weiss, and I've been working at the program on negotiation for a number of years now, and I've had the pleasure of working with Jason Matusow from Microsoft in the last year. And he's the general manager of Microsoft's team that works on international standards. And through my experiences, it's been very interesting dynamics involved in the kinds of negotiations that they undertake and are involved in. And when Jason and I were talking, I thought it would be quite interesting for the community here to come to understand a little bit of the challenges and dynamics that are involved in these kinds of negotiations. In particular, there are two that were quite interesting to me that I'll just mention off the bat. The first is that in these standards bodies, there's groups that come together for interoperability and having to come up with a common platform for different technology. And so what that does is ultimately puts companies who are in the competitive marketplace at a table with each other, needing to cooperate initially to get those standards. And then once they've achieved that goal, going back to or competing around some of those products. And Jason will talk a whole lot more about that element. But the interesting part of that is that those folks, it's not a one-off kind of negotiation. This is a continual process where they're dealing with the same people over and over again. And so there's an interesting competitive cooperative dynamic at play. And the other is also that there's sort of a multiple allegiances question, that there are folks who work for Microsoft or other companies and are also part of national standards bodies in their own country. And so it creates a bit of a challenge or a question of how do they manage that issue. So Jason's going to talk about some of this for about a half an hour and lay out a number of different negotiation elements that are at play here. And then we're going to have a bit of a commentary from Larry Susskind from MIT, who's a professor and co-founder of the program on negotiation, and Samuel Muli-Dinar, who is somebody who's been working with the program on negotiation for a while, teaching a mediation class, and has quite a bit of background in standards work as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason just to say that Jason is quite an interesting fellow, has worked at Microsoft for a number of years, actually went to Boston University, so is familiar with our part of the world here, and started out by creating a company and cutting his teeth in that world and seeing where that took him, which ultimately took him to Microsoft, into debt, for sure.
That's where that particular adventure took me.
But a very good learning experience nonetheless, right? So let me turn it over to Jason, and we'll have him talk for a bit, and then we'll open it up to everybody.
All right, thank you, Josh. So I feel like we're balanced here. Everybody's over on this side of the room, so I feel like I'm getting pulled this way. Okay, so thank you, Josh. It's been an interesting process working with the project on negotiation. I actually sought them out because I came to the recognition that I have 20 people working for me. Microsoft has quite literally hundreds of people who are involved in this work at any given time. Other technology companies have on the order of thousands of people involved in these things at different times, and you can look at a company like Boeing that has 40,000 engineers engaged in standards at a given time. And I realized that 80%, 90% of the work of my team is either spent preparing for, engaging in, or dealing with negotiation. And it was a remarkable realization, and the more that I've worked with, not only with Josh, but thinking about this topic, it has in fact enhanced that opinion even more. And so the importance of this topic has become paramount for me. I am a manager of negotiators, and that's a very important designation that I want to make because we have made a conscious decision. Our leadership team thinks about this. We choose not to have the negotiators effectively, the leadership team are not the negotiators themselves. And there are some very good reasons for that, and I'll come to that, but it's been a very educational process within that. But I want to do something a little bit screwy to help you understand the world that we're in. So, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. How do we get an elf, a magic elf, to buy a spaceship? Okay? So what does this mean? Well, now I'm using this as an example. There's the world of massive multiplayer online games. I am not a gamer myself, because I recognize crack cocaine when I see it. I understand that people spend an awful lot of time doing this. But this is a world, virtual world, it's a game, right? People are, they're magicians and knights and whatnot. They pay $12 to $15 a month to do this. There's real money into the system. And you start looking at an annuity revenue stream, $12 to $15 a month times 500,000 users a month, it's a lot of money. You start talking about games in China that now have 4 million people online. These have economies. They have unbelievable amount of man hours going into them, development, capabilities, everything else. This is an industry. So you have EverQuest by Sony. And in EverQuest, you might have a guy. This is a person sitting behind a keyboard who develops a character, and they do all kinds of things. Well, what is it that they're doing? Ultimately, what they're doing is that they're amassing wealth and reputation. Just like on eBay, where you have the ability to say, oh, that one's a good seller or this one's a good buyer, they develop reputation and gold pieces that they find or swords that they find on their adventures and can sell them and everything else. And ultimately, what they do with this wealth is they buy stuff. They have ships or they have castles or anything else. So, along comes a different game. Suddenly, you've got a space-based game. Instead of Dungeons and Dragons with knights and warriors, you've got a space adventure. And possibly, you have a challenge where you would say, and this is a challenge from both sides, you have the user, and that user looks at another game and says, boy, that game looks really cool, and I wish I had a spaceship on that game. All right, so what am I getting at here? The reality is, as an industry, you're going to want to have people with good reputations, who are good players, who are good netizens, or whatever else you want to call them, and I want them to participate. And if I'm the owner of the game, if I'm the company that's running that game, how do I encourage good behavior? Standards come in a very interesting way in this. You would start to say, how am I going to get that person to come across? Well, maybe what I can do is all I need to do is to focus on their reputation. A very, very narrow scope of the technology. But the companies involved and the players involved start to care about, if I make that change, I've invested hundreds of hours of my life and I buy lots of ships and magic swords and everything else, and I've proven that I'm a trustworthy game player. If I go and play this other game and I start from scratch, well, that sucks. That's just an enormous waste of time and everything else that I don't want to build up again. There's a real barrier to somebody choosing to make that change. So the companies that are involved might look at this and say, why would I want to do that? And the reason is, they're all part of the same industry. Say, oh, there's this massive multiplayer online gaming industry. Billions of dollars being spent on revenue streams, on R&D, on, there's transactions going in all kinds of different directions. There's lots of competition. But we all, as members of this industry, we want to see it grow. Okay, and so then the next step is you start to recognize that each company has an interest in keeping their intellectual property unique in many cases, or the secrets, the trade secrets that are behind how they build their game or something else. They may not want to share all that stuff, or the graphical designs of their world or anything else. There are things that they want to keep unique. They want to stay competitive. But, interestingly enough, they both want to drive value into their products for their customer. And if their customer perceives that, hey, if I build reputation doing lots of things, my sense of my dollars spent in this game go up, and I can attract new customers. And yeah, I'm opening a hole by sharing this idea of reputation among games, but if the whole environment is better players and whatnot, well, things get more interesting. So in essence, the standard would be a very narrowly scoped set of protocols, potentially, that would allow reputation to move from one game to another. I wouldn't have to share all the other secret sauce that I might want to hold on to. Again, this doesn't exist. This is a fictional standard, but the idea being, people would then sit around a standards body. It could be a very informal consortia. It could go all the way up to a highly formalized process. It could take anywhere from 18 months to 3 years to get it done. A lot of investment. People often don't realize that when you start talking about the creation of a shared engineering specification, travel and expense, engineering time, you don't send the green engineer who just came out of college to these meetings. You usually have to send the 15 to 20-year experienced person to those meetings. Lawyers have to be involved. It's a very big process to get there. PR and product competition that all has to get thought about. And ultimately you end up with this reputation spec in my fictional world here, approved, fine. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of the world in which I live and the type of thinking that has to go on. So I'm going to tear this back down to basic concepts just for a second. The first is a standard is just a stack of paper. Now you will all deal with standards every day. DVD, 4G, LTE, TCP/IP, all these endless acronyms of different technologies are standards. They are formed when companies get together and they sit down and they describe a technology and they come to a common agreement on that technology. And at the end of the day, they run off and they go build it, and that's the implementation. The implementation usually has hundreds of different standards in it. You take a product like Windows. We did what we called the Wallow book years ago. We had one page, one standard. The book was this thick, front and back, every page of all the different standards that were in the product. Right? It is a function of engineering to have to deal with specifications and have to do implementations, and you make all kinds of choices as you go through that process. The next thing is, what is a standards body? Standards body is an organization with the goal of producing standards. The thing is, you need to have two sides of the equation, always. There has to be contributions of new ideas in, and there has to be the opportunity for implementation on the back end. There is well over 100 years now of industrial policy and law structured around the nature of this engagement. This is not just about the technology industry. In fact, there are three different kinds of standards out there, really. There's metrology. How long is a foot? I think NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, just recently completed a 2-year process to redefine how long a second was. Right? So metrology is the fundamental standard underpinning of every aspect of commerce in our society. The original standard was in China, I think it was the LAKH lock. I'm not pronouncing it right, I'm sure, but it was a unit of measure of rice and wheat for trade. Right? So metrology is the first. Health and safety is the second. So there are health and safety standards, and metrology standards tend to be mandatory. They tend to be number of fire extinguishers or fire suppression systems, or elevators not dropping out of the top of the shaft and falling down, or whatever else it might be. Those tend to be mandatory by industry forming the standard, but government then saying the safety must be adhered to. The third then is interoperability, and that is the voluntary standard system. We work primarily in the voluntary standard system, but ultimately you get people producing stuff, adding in contributions, and then on the back end, anybody can go build it. Here in the law school, I don't know how many of you are from the business side, from the law side, a standards body is a fascinating legal framework. It is the house in which the contributors can walk in with intellectual property and feel safe from each other and from all other players as they share those ideas. And that house is a very important house for this aspect of it. And then on the back end, it allows implementers to go and build stuff that they can then feel protected, safe, assured from the contributors. And the contributors, some choose to use this as a revenue mechanism. They bring in patents, and then the licensing of those patents. A company like Qualcomm is almost entirely built upon the revenue streams, effectively getting technologies into standards and then monetizing that IP through the adoption of those standards. A company like Microsoft, I can name maybe 2 standards of the literally tens of thousands that we've been involved in that we've ever generated revenue on as IP included in a standard. So you do lots of different things. You choose to treat your intellectual property in different ways, but there's something called reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, which is the big argument over the past few years about how that's being dealt with that governs this process. It also allows Microsoft and IBM, 2 companies who've run into some challenges with the Justice Department over the years. We can sit down at the table, collaborate, and not violate the antitrust laws. And in fact, just about every, I think all of the competition laws out there recognize standards as one of the mechanisms by which that collaboration can happen safely. So, the next thing is that there are many different kinds of standards out there. There are as many standards bodies as there are grains of sand, it seems. You have individual consortia that happen at a very industry-driven level, things that happen nationally, regionally, and internationally. And the further you go up the stack, the more process and the heavier the investment it takes to get something through that process. Ultimately, when things go through either ISO or ITUT, or ITU, it's basically like working through a United Nations proposal. You have countries, you have very formalized processes, you have very significant timelines involved, but it goes essentially from fast to slow is one way to think about this, but it also then goes from very de facto industry adoption-driven results in the marketplace all the way through to government mandate and government and significant government recognition. One of the big ways of dealing with the WTO and the technical barriers to trade, standards are one of the big vehicles of discussion relative to that, but the standards have to come through the international standard system to be particularly effective in that discussion. So, I'm not going to spend more time on this, but just understand that each one of these standards bodies, and this is a very interesting dynamic, are all in competition with each other. The people at ISO do not like the people at ITUT. They do not like the people at IEC. They are skeptical of the people at ETSI. The guys in OASIS don't like the guys at the W3C, and companies like ours are actually rather happy with that. To tell you the truth, I would much rather an environment, lots of standards bodies that are fully competitive with each other, because I will always forum shop and choose where and when I choose to take a technology to a different location at a different time for all kinds of different reasons. Okay, so why standards? I'll do this fairly quickly because I want to get to the negotiation discussion. There are really 4 reasons why people go to a standards body. The first and most common, at least in my world, is you want to see adoption of a given technology, preferably as close as possible to your own technology. I'll give you an example of Cisco, for example, in the IETF, which is a place that deals with a lot of core networking technology. They will, in those committees, you get one engineer gets one vote. Not one company, one vote. One engineer, one vote. And so they will have product development going in parallel with the standards work. They'll send 60 or 70 engineers into that environment, sometimes up to 200 to a single meeting. And in doing so, make sure that by the time the standard is released, the product is released at the same time. Oddly enough, they look just like each other, and they have a time to market advantage in what comes out into the marketplace. Right? Gaming the system is fundamentally what the system is about. Nobody comes to a standards meeting by mistake. There has never yet been somebody who's created a standard by tripping, whoops, we developed a 900-page engineering specification. Everybody has an agenda. Everybody has things that they're trying to accomplish, and it makes the meetings rather interesting. Very often standards are the building block for an entire industry. You can see very centralized standards that become then the basis by which big things happen. HTML was a standard, right? And that standard creates this incredibly rich internet experience, the web experience that people have. Of course, the internet itself is a much bigger, broader set of technologies than just HTML. TCP/IP was a protocol that was a set of protocols that was originally developed that allowed the internet to happen, right? So you can take these things in big market creation opportunities. Academics very often are involved in standards bodies simply because they want to move the state of the art forward. They don't have a commercial interest per se, but they absolutely are trying to drive and push and mold the industry in particular directions or the set of technologies in a given set of directions. And then the last one, which is the one that nobody likes to talk about because it's very hush-hush. But if you are not the leader of a market segment, a great way to unseat that incumbent is to get a standard that hurts them into the marketplace and drive adoption of that standard, and then you can be very effective at displacing a leader. This has been tried against Microsoft time and again. Microsoft has tried it time and again, sometimes with success, sometimes with failure. It is a highly competitive tool. And in fact, and is increasingly, Josh and I were just having coffee before this, I was talking to him about China. China uses standards as a geopolitical competitive tool. So we are seeing some very interesting dynamics forming around standards for that. So in the interest of time, I will not spend a lot of time on this, but this slide was really about, from a company's perspective, as you're planning to enter into a standards body, we go through a very detailed analysis where you start to say, what is my market position? Am I a leader in this particular market segment? Am I a follower? Am I trying to just be an implementer? Those are going to be questions that will dictate what approach you're going to take to a given standard. What is the competitive landscape? Who are the products and technologies that are out there? What am I trying to do in the market relative to a given piece? So, let's go back to the wars between Netscape and Microsoft and all of the accusations that flew back and forth about HTML. You're not doing the pure HTML. Turns out nobody was doing the pure HTML because everybody always wants to take a standard and then go beyond the standard. If the whole world was vanilla technology, there would be no sales, right? Everybody has to go differentiate. It's one of the basic, fundamental underpinnings of economics is that scarcity drives value. So if my product does nothing unique, then what am I doing? Right? So everybody wants to have a standard, some commonality, but then compete above and beyond that. And that line is the fight, always. Where are you setting that line? If I'm an IBM and I have a huge consulting business, I would probably like to see that line get higher and higher and higher. Because then I have an excuse to put very expensive consultants in there. It's really got to get these standards to work out. It's really complicated. And if you're a product company like us, we want to push that line down and down and down and down because I want to have the maximum amount of unique capability. So that line is the fight, and it's a big, big discussion on any technology piece. You got to figure out where you are. Then the game theory and the game playing that we go into is significant on every engagement. IP, treatment of patents, it's become a huge discussion. If you've been reading the Wall Street Journal over the past 18 months, you'll have noticed there's been a bit of a kerfuffle around mobile phones lately. Apple and Samsung have been in a bit of a fight. Microsoft and Motorola have been in a bit of a fight. There are a number of companies that are suing each other on this. And what is at the heart of the lawsuits? Standards essential patents. What are the roles of patents in the standard? When do you disclose if I have a patent? What are the implications of pricing on those? These are huge legal battles that are falling out of this process. And then the last piece is regulation. Very often governments look to standards as a means of achieving a regulatory goal without passing a regulation. If I mandate the use of a standard, I don't have to write a regulation, and the industry doesn't tend to bitch and moan as much because, hey, it's a standard, right? You guys came up with a standard, I'm just saying you need to use it. There's this very fine relationship between the role of regulatory action and how standards are used, and so we are constantly watching segments. And now, the role of cloud computing, for those of you who are following sort of technology trends, as borders become a lot less important in the nature of how data flows. So jurisdictional issues come up, and all of these concepts of how data protection is being handled. You start to realize that the standards that are going to be applied become increasingly important as governments may not have the ability to truly have regulatory authority over the whole cloud. Nobody does because it's truly global. But if they can push certain standards, they're going to be able to see other certain goals achieved. So by way of introduction of my team, I think that it's probably just worth saying that we're distributed globally because the world that I deal with is the negotiations that we're involved with are truly global. It's lovely builds that I did. The idea is a 104-country matrix, and you have to, if you're going to be influential in this mix, you're going to have to think about how you place your people where they are and how we engage in negotiations. This leads to the dynamic that Josh was just talking about. The work that we do is varied across, I could spend an enormous amount of time talking about each of these different topics. I don't know if this one went by too quickly. This is probably where we spend most of our time on these, but the list goes on and on and on. So, I want to talk about negotiation just for the last 10 to 12 minutes here. The people who work for me, I consider the title that we use internally when we think about them, technical diplomats. They are all engineers. In fact, they all have 20 or 30 years of engineering experience. They've all been product managers at different times, or program managers, or developers. I got a bunch of research physicists on my team, people who've done very interesting different work in the past, but now they have the patience, to tell you the truth, the discipline to go through these longer processes and to think about what it means to have diplomatic conversations, and what the trade-offs are, how you build consensus, how you build allegiances and coalitions, and all those things that come over time. So we think of them as technical diplomats. The first topic then for us is this idea of allegiances that Josh alluded to. Frankly, if I have an employee who is sitting on the German National Standards Body, in fact, currently, the chairman of the German National Standards Body for Technology is a Microsoft employee. When he goes to an international meeting, he takes his Microsoft hat off, sets it over. He is now a representative of Germany. He has to act in a neutral way. He can't allow favoritism of one company's agenda or another come into play. He has to play a very neutral role. It's even weirder than that when you realize that he starts to form an allegiance to the standards body that he works with itself. He knows those rules. He has that community of experts that now respect him. And in fact, there's a dynamic that as a manager we're always very aware of, is when somebody, we call it going native. When they start to have a much greater allegiance to the standards body than to their employer. And in fact, there are people that I know, and some people who work for us now, but people that I've seen over time who are, let's say they're an IETF specialist or an IEEE specialist or something. They hold their positions of leadership as individuals and not as companies. So when they stop working for one company, they go to another company because they're being hired because, hey, this guy's got this really important position. He's far more loyal to the standards body than he is to the company who's paying his salary. And that is a fundamental truism that is just part of the standards ecosystem at all times. But you end up with this really funny scenario. And the topic that Josh and I ended up spending quite a bit of time talking about, in fact, we brought it up yet again today, is this idea of confidentiality. When somebody on the German national body is going to be negotiating with the Russians and the Chinese on something, when he gets that information about what the German national position is going to be, can he share that information with his colleague in Beijing or in Moscow who works on our team? Maybe. Starts to ask some really interesting questions. We did a whole bunch of legal analysis on it. I brought my lawyers in. We went very deep on this. And there's a reality which is, according to the confidentiality agreements, if the company learns something, then all of us can learn it. We can share information freely within the company without breaking any official rules. But you certainly might be breaking trust. You might be breaking other relationships. And so it's up to each individual to decide, oh, well, this negotiating position I'm not sharing with my colleagues today because I'm going to be in the room sitting across from somebody who might be also a Microsoft employee at the time representing his or her country, and I'm going to need to be getting the best thing for my country within that negotiation. It raises all kinds of interesting dynamics and questions about conflicts of interest and everything else, but this is a reality of the system. And so everybody is always every standards participant is always dealing with multiple allegiances. And if they hold a chairmanship, if they hold a leadership role in that standards body, they are bound by rules to behave in certain ways. And if they're on the board of that standards body, they are supposed to promote that standards body. And we get this all the time. I've got somebody sitting on the board of a standards body, and Microsoft makes a decision to go with a different standards body, and all of a sudden his phone rings and says, how dare you, you guys took that work over to those guys. Yeah, you're on our board, you're supposed to make that not happen. And so you get a very funny dynamic. So allegiances is a big topic. The process. You don't want to see a sausage made, you don't want to see a standard made. That's the reason for the picture. The reality is that the best diplomats know the rules cold. The rule book for ISO is, yay thick. Every last little thing is dictated. When somebody goes to one of these meetings and they're negotiating, sometimes the most powerful person in the room works for himself or a tiny little company and holds everybody else at bay because he knows the rules exceedingly well. If you are a follower of the internet governance fight that is underway right now, the role of the ITU and what's happening with the control of the internet. There was a big meeting in Dubai just in December called WCIT, W-C-I-T, the World Conference on Information Technology. I can't remember what it stands for, but literally they were opening the ITU treaty, which is a 100-plus-year-old treaty that governs telecommunications and flow of data or information between countries and tax revenues and all kinds of other things. The guy who dominated that meeting is from Iran, and he's been at ITU for 30 years, knows the process better than everybody, and forced a whole bunch of things to happen in a room of like 500 delegates, where you're talking about a massively geopolitically charged discussion. And this guy from Iran everybody knows that he was the most influential person in the room because he knew the process better than the other people who were engaged. Sequencing. If you're the chairman of a committee, you can control what item comes to the agenda at what time. And that is an enormously powerful negotiating tool. Even if you're the chairman and you're supposed to give everybody their say and you're supposed to be neutral, the controlling of the sequencing is something that people use all the time. You see this across the board. This is not something, again, that is a Microsoft-specific discussion. This is the nature of standardization committees and how you deal with it. When do you raise certain issues in the negotiation? When are you going to be willing to talk about different elements of the technology or what you're trying to get to? The sequencing is a piece. And I'll tell you, I have one of the guys on my team is a master of this topic, and we have him mentoring other people on our team all the time. In fact, I'll very often be in preparatory meetings, and I'll say, have you talked to Jim yet about your sequencing plan? Have you had this conversation? No, we haven't gotten there. Well, you don't go to that meeting until you go talk to him. He's our sequencing master. You gotta know when you're supposed to be doing that. He has a way of just sorting things out and coming up with it. Milestones, big one. The last one I wanted to talk about here is important, is the table. Standards meetings happen sometimes in rooms like this, sometimes around a little conference table, depends on how many people are involved. But I'll tell you this, very few of the real decisions happen in the room. What happens at the table is interesting, can be very, very important, obviously, because that's the room where hands go up and things get voted on. But the coffee break, the bar after the meeting, that's the power. That's the decision. That's when the influence happens. So we will go into standards meetings with a matrix of the people who are in the room, who are going to be there. And you say, I'll say to people on my team, who are you going to be having coffee with? Your coffee break is not a break, right? It is not time to relax. That's the time when things happen. So that's sort of the unofficial process. Power asymmetry. There are times, and in Microsoft's past, in fact, we developed a very terrible reputation in standards bodies because we would show up with a document that we had written, technology, huge technology. We would say, this is going to be shipped in Windows. It'll be on a few 100 million machines next year. Standardize it, no changes. Thank you very much. Right? That's a power asymmetry. Turns out you make a lot of enemies that way. Right? Piss off an awful lot of people. There are times that even as a big company, you show up and you sit down and you have no power in that room. Because the power is held by somebody who's been in that room for 30 years, who's an academic or an individual consultant, has nothing to do with marketplace dynamics. That has everything to do with the strength of that individual or their capability. There are times we walk in a room now, for example, that Apple, far more powerful on a SIM technology. We have no say in it, and they're just throwing their weight around, right? Power asymmetries show up all the time. And so for your negotiator, they need to be very conscious of when they have that power and when not. There are also dynamics, and this is, we were going through our negotiation training, and going through the whole getting to yes framework that a lot of our people reacted very negatively to, which was the disassociation of power from the discussion in some ways about principled negotiation. And there's an interesting debate to be had. There are a lot of times that companies with an awful lot of resource are going to look at a standards body, and IBM is classic on this. They work with the standards body, they collaborate right up to the point where it's going sideways on them, and they just say, oh, by the way, I'm going over here, and I'm going to stand up an entirely new standards body that didn't exist up till 3 days ago, and IBM's name is going to be the charter name. And by the way, I'm bringing 700 of my partners with me. You guys die, these guys live, and they're going to do my technology. Right? That this idea of negotiation strength and the power asymmetries that are involved are a fundamental reality that always have to be addressed. And I think it's a much bigger part of negotiation planning than I think we usually put thinking into. The meeting attendance, last point is, I want to get to the last slide very quickly here, but the standards world is a world of pay to play, is what I call it. Who's got the bigger travel budget? It's a terrible reality. This is a terrible reality for the developing countries of the world. The ISO standard system, which is fully inclusive, 104 countries engaged, any country can get involved that wants to be there. They're allowed to just raise their hand and say, I want to be a full participating member. The vast majority of them can't afford to send their representatives to the meetings. And the meetings are held all over the world. Unfortunately, very often where the chairman's wife wants to go on vacation seems to dictate a lot. I'm not kidding. And I don't mean that to be I realize that may have come across as a sexist comment. I don't mean it to be that. But we have a lot of retirees who are senior professional engineers. There are very few women involved in the system today. And you end up with these guys who then literally say, oh, we're going to have this next meeting in Rio because my wife wants to go there. We've literally been told this on numerous occasions. So can you pay to get your people there and be there is a significant piece of it. I'll let you read this. So being the manager of negotiators is a funny process. But for us, as I said at the beginning, we choose to disassociate management of the team from the direct technical diplomats. And the reason comes down to a number of things. The fact of the matter is that we have to anchor the work of the standards against the product group requirements on a constant basis. And the companies that we succeed against in negotiations tend to have the same person running the standards organization as the guy going to the meetings. So he or she is not spending the time back on the home front making sure that things are as aligned as they need to be. The other side of it is the constant juggling of how you use your resources to go to which fora at which time. There's what I even think of a sequencing of people and how and where we send them. I go out of my way to seek diversity on the team, both race, experience, capability. We talk about, we were just chatting also about DISC before. I'm very conscious about the different personality types that are on the team and the different needs that we have at different times. But we see great diversity in the types of individuals who are involved because it is a fundamental factor to being successful. And then this last one is one that I wish I was better at. We have started this process, but a culture of postmortems is an enormously important part of the standards negotiation process. Can you really codify not only the preparatory process, but afterwards, what did you learn? And then that is a function of management because the people involved, they're running so fast that they just don't have the time to sit back and do it. The funny thing about the standards world is that a standards negotiation can take 3 years to get something through the system. And so everybody always has this impression, you say, 3 years, how hard could this job be? I mean, it's such a slow process. Well, we're handling between 25 and 30 different key standards at any given time, each one with every 6-month major negotiation cycles, every meeting coming up. You end up with this constant churn where you're supposed to go through 60 or 80 submissions from different companies and pick them apart and pick what you're doing and everything else. It is a hugely frenetic lifestyle for these individuals. And so that process of forcing the postmortem and thinking through how we learned and what we learned from that is critical to the success. So I think I'm 5 minutes over or 7 minutes over the half an hour. Thank you.
So, Jason, let's have a seat up.
If I sit here, I'm going to be blocked off from the entire audience. Let's shift the chair around. Why don't you shift them that way? Okay. Same for anybody sitting around. Slide down this one.
So, thank you, and thanks, Jason. As you can see, there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on here. It's a complicated world. As I started working with Jason and his folks, I kept trying to get my head around it and found that I'd get something and then miss something else. So I think I'm finally slowly getting it all, and there's a lot of interesting challenges from a negotiation perspective, which is really what I think Jason's highlighted very well for all of us, and would love to hear a little bit from Muli Dinar and then Larry Susskind about some of what Jason's talked about, as well as any other kind of comments, questions that you might have. So Muli, do you want to go ahead and start, and then we'll just then turn it out to the audience for questions as well.
Oh, thank you, Jason. I think this is a wonderful overview. What fascinated me was sort of the international aspects in the different countries and the different standards. My background's more in the aerospace standards. I've been involved with RTCA, which is, again, a private partner. Published, been working for many decades and doing exactly what you said, and both getting the companies together and serving as that government place where they can come safely create the standard that then the regulator imposes for safety and for competitiveness reasons. But each country does their own thing. And Microsoft being global, I mean, we as the US were one of the first 17 countries to adopt the metric system as a standard. Today we're one of the only 3 that actually don't use it in many of our places. And you know, the adoption worldwide is this big struggle between the countries. So how do you as Microsoft get into your corporate policy versus the different countries going? Like you said, you have 2 representatives sitting, maybe one in Europe, one in Asia.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated on that aspect. If you can elaborate.
One of the interesting things, our team is based in the law and corporate affairs division of Microsoft. We do not work for the CTO or most companies, in fact, align their standards, corporate standards function in through their chief technology or some sort of product side. We have lots of standards people who use stuff through the product groups, but our corporate function is very tied to our political and legal team construct because of exactly what you're getting at. And part of that's a hard lesson learned from the Europeans and the US. So certain behaviors have been modified.
Larry, you want to take one or?
Okay. Well, I guess I snagged on the statement that a regulation or a standard is nothing but a stack of papers. I think of a standard as a cost-benefit ratio, benefits to costs and their distribution. And anytime you set a standard, you are in fact implying that there'll be a set of benefits and a set of costs, and in any particular context, those will be distributed in a certain way. So the 2 worlds that I work in, not information technology and not aerospace, but environment and health and safety. And when we talk about setting in standards in the form of regulations, not informal, not unofficial, but formal standards, we're deciding if you're going to say how many parts per million of small particles in the environment. If you set it so that the most vulnerable in the population are protected, then you're creating a set of costs that are distributed on those who generate particular particles of a certain size. If you say, well, we should set the standard to protect the average person, then the costs implied and their distribution are different, but so are the benefits. So if you think about a standard as a statement of benefits over costs and their distribution, then the question is, whose interests ought to be represented in that process? And you talked about the different entities that exist that are regulatory bodies. In the world of environment, I work on the setting of informal standards. So if you want to get together, as World Wildlife Federation has done, all the people who process any kind of seafood in the world to talk about what do we as the environmental community or the resource management community interested in sustainable management of seafood want to set as our informal standard, but we will get to say it. Won't be some regulatory body telling us. So this is the informal standard that you mentioned. And what's really interesting is as you decrease from formal to informal, you increase from the engagement of a small number of technical spokespeople to a large number of stakeholder representatives. So if you see a trade-off between whose interests ought to be engaged when you are making this judgment about costs and benefits and their distribution, informal standard setting will in fact create opportunities to increase the role of more stakeholders more directly. It doesn't mean there isn't scientific and technical input into it. It just also means that there's a lot more representatives of stakeholder groups. So I'm interested in how we would know a good standard from a bad standard. And if you think about costs and benefits and their distribution, it begins to provide a way of thinking about judging about standards. The last point I want to make is I also work with the pharmaceutical industry. And pharmaceutical industry dominated by global players. And if you're Pfizer, you have to negotiate the same product's entry into every single country where you want to sell separately. Even in Europe, there isn't a European procedure for entering that market. Every single negotiation has to be done differently. And you might say, well, come on. I mean, we want to make these drugs so that they reach people in the most effective way. Why don't we just have one standard for judging whether a drug or a medical device is okay, because that's the standard that's being set? Well, no, each country wants to make a different decision about what's safe enough or what's adequate, and that, of course, affects the price of the drug. And what testing even, and what results of what kind of experimental work is acceptable. And in that context, we've made a decision. That's a global market, dominated by global players, and yet it doesn't sound like the story that you were describing at all. And even though it would make sense from an efficiency standpoint to globalize the standard in the process of setting it, from the standpoint of political or sovereignty considerations, and thus the description of what benefits and what costs visited on whom in what way, we want to decentralize that process. So coming from this other angle, I see different kinds of questions about global or international standard setting.
One of the interesting things, there's two things I'd land on there is, right now, globally, there are three big models competing with each other for how standards are being discussed. Now, you remember, the word standard is like anything else. It can be used a bunch of different ways. That's why I was very careful a moment ago to differentiate between health and safety, metrology, and voluntary interoperable standards, because there are distinct different approaches and philosophies that come to each, particularly from a public policy standpoint. But right now, if you look at the United States, traditionally, the idea is of industry driving consortia, so this idea of coming together at will, voluntary basis, for standardization, and then duking it out in the marketplace. And some standards win and some standards lose. Beta was a better technology than VHS. It lost, right? So you have you have different, debates that can go on, but fundamentally you have industry-driven approach. The Europeans have taken a different approach as they privatized a lot of state industry and whatnot. They still weren't willing to give up all of the control that they had in the past. And so the European model has tended to be, here is an area that we think standards should be, and we will create a European directive that there should be green IT standards. There should be mobile communication standards. Now, you industry players, you talk within that framework that I'm setting for you. And then there's the Chinese approach now, which is we would like a standard, and here's the government going to help author this standard, and this is the standard we're going to make it mandatory. Those three models have been, as the economies of these three major pieces compete, are now driving the discussion. Strangely enough, in the United States, smart grid, cloud computing, and now cybersecurity are all areas where the administration is saying, there should be standards in this box. You industry players now sort it out this way. They're taking a very European approach to how those areas are going to be addressed. And these are three massive areas of interest that are going to affect society very, very broadly.
When they say you industry players should work it out in the box, what representation of public interests is provided for within that box?
It is open to all participation.
So
you have
that
academics,
you could have more non-industry players than industry players in the box described as.
So,
Absolutely.
I mean, I'll share an example
I
from.
was using the word industry, but you're.
Yeah, I'll share an example from the next generation airspace. So GPS has really changed the way aircraft fly in the airspace globally, not just here. And the air traffic control system and the equipment on the aircraft hasn't caught up with that, and everybody's sitting around waiting because there's a hope the government will subsidize it when things break down, because it used to be government-owned. So the industry is not getting together. And eventually the government's going to regulate something. But when it comes together, and it's like the government mandates, there are pilot associations, there are aerospace labor unions, there are airport authorities. So everybody's interested in the standards about a piece of equipment that goes on an airplane because of all that public interest. So in a way, it extends to what is your philosophy about government and government's role. And in certain areas, the government says, we need to be competitive, we need to move forward, and if industry's not moving fast enough, we'll be the catalyst, and we'll get them to the table to start a standard. I think that's what's happening.
Or there's a public interest. There's
a huge public interest.
For, the preservation of the ecosystem. So green IT. Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, you guys all, God knows, we all use our devices all day. The internet is a coal-fired, heavy consumer of electricity. Each of the data centers that goes in consumes enough power for a city of, 80,000 people. These data centers are going up like mushrooms. And so you have the government comes in and says, hey, whoa, wait a second. There's probably a broader public interest. You guys should have standards in this space, and that's where smart grid comes in, and there's all kinds of other issues that are associated with that. Cybersecurity now has been in the papers nonstop. The attacks from China, the perceived threats to all business and everything else. There's a recognition that this is an area that requires real additional thought. But the open source community, as an example, is in the technology world. It is a great example of where the individual can have an incredibly strong voice, completely detached from any corporate association they have or not. They are able to come in and have a participation.
But once you suggest, and particularly as Millie just did, that, well, it's just a lot of possible actors who are stakeholders, then the question becomes, what should the process be by which stakeholders are identified, and what should the process be by which inequalities of the sort you were highlighting under asymmetries be addressed in the management of the conversation, given differential access to information or ability to hire people with 40 years experience from Iran versus somebody else. And in some other arenas, we've seen transformation from a kind of ad hoc conversation or a kind of administrative hearings model where a small number of players with the most experience pretty much dominate, draft the rule, come in, talk about it some more. Others are given a chance to comment in the sort of review and comment style of administrative law, but basically it's controlled by key actors. We've seen a shift from that to a more collaborative process managed by a neutral. And so the question is, what does it take to transform the standard setting process so that there's a commitment to some minimum standards of a fair process to ensure the public interest is served, not necessarily just to say it's open so that those who want to come on down can come on down, because that doesn't necessarily equal, I would argue, a fair process from the standpoint of inequalities in access to information and expertise, and it doesn't guarantee time and transparency and access in a way that allows people with different abilities in different locations to participate.
And we've actually had quite a few conversations about, we have a vested interest in seeing greater participation from all of the countries in which we do business. The more we see an economy pick up technology and have its citizenry using technology, then the more versions of Windows and Office will sell, right? We're motivated by the interest of building products to sell them. That's what we do. But fundamentally, we also recognize that you want to see the whole entire marketplace grow. And so one of the challenges that we've had is how do we help bring developing economies into the standard system in an effective way? First of all, most technology companies, us included, if I go to our product teams, hate the idea of the international standard system. It's slow, it's arduous, it's painful, everything else. Come on, let's go super fast. This is way too slow. So that's a problem. And the second piece is how do you help grow the experts and then have them participate in these countries. And we live in a world now with Skype, right, or with all these other technologies that allow video teleconferencing effectively, yet none of the rules support the ability to do that. They say the only voting right you have is if you're in the room, right? And so we've been trying to break down those barriers, but those are things that are set up over 30 years of process and whatnot, and they're very worried about fairness and voting processes and whatnot, and each standards body has its own rules and its own history and its own behaviors, and it is a non-trivial task to break that down.
But we could point to two innovations that actually do address this problem of trying to get all these countries involved. If you look at the context of global treaty making, right, there's a formal procedure when 193, 5, 7 countries get together to draft a treaty. First of all, figure 10 years, okay, not 3. And then you have the G77 or the developing countries saying, wait a minute, we want to be the chair of the process. But you don't have the experienced people. Why should you be the chair? Because you always are the chair. We want to be the chair. And then where is the meeting going to be held? And who's going to give the money for the bottom 30 countries in terms of GDP to send a delegation of more than one person to be part of it? Now, in the face of all of that, two things have made a difference. The first is to have informal, collaborative processes to generate proposals to go into the formal process. So in that informal process, you can have meetings in different regions. You can have people with more background, skill, and knowledge go and hold an African session or a Latin session and use that as occasions to generate regional or collaborative proposals. And because those are informal, there are no formal restrictions on where you can meet, how you can meet. You could do it on Skype. You could do it in a variety of ways because it's not decision-making. It's the use of informal conversation, collaborative conversation to generate proposals. The second is to have those processes managed by a team of professional neutrals who can be the ones moving around with a single text. Again, it's informal, but if they are also the people chosen by the licensing or the standard setting or the regulatory body, I mean, the WTO now finally, when it sees a problem coming, will use professional neutral to manage what, in all of their rules, doesn't call for mediation. And if you have someone whose job is to help ensure that the process ends up being credible relative to these other considerations, and isn't there advancing the interests of one company or one country, it can make a difference. And so I would argue we should look for ways of adding ad hoc, informal, proposal-generating activities to existing formal standard-setting processes, which can be done online at lower cost. And secondly, adding a new cadre of people to facilitate those conversations who are in fact process managers for the standard setting.
Yeah, and I think some of these standard bodies pride themselves on their people, because they have their own people employed full-time.
That's right.
And on their people being experts at getting this consensus building, or getting at this, separating their hats
Right.
of the people that join the committees, or they keep tabs on the chair and the board to make sure they appropriately behave, because that's what drives their mandate, whether it's the mandate from the people or from the corporations or from the regulating authorities that say, we want to explore this thing and we want someone to get it moving, but we can't wait 10 years because I'm a politician and my term is 4 years and I want to see progress in 3 years, so I'm going to go to this standards body and I want a proposal for a rule in 3 years. And that's, I think they have the expertise in-house, or they claim to have the expertise in-house. And that's what differentiates one standard body from the other. And I wonder, when you make a choice of the standard bodies, is that what you look at? Is there consensus building process or whatever?
There's always, and who's involved, which are the experts in the room, who has strength. I mean, the process of forum shopping is an art in and of itself.
Right.
But there's an enormous set of issues that go into that. The other piece that comes out for our negotiators who work on the web technologies, World Wide Web Consortium. So right now I work very closely with the editor of HTML5, one of the co-editors, the Microsoft guy who represents us in that committee. There is an enormous amount of work done on compliance tests. And in fact, he who controls the compliance test, who writes the compliance test, can greatly influence the outcome in the industry, because you can write a test that'll make your competitor's product fail and yours look great, right? And so there's this huge debate always about what's the test and how compliant and whatnot, and whether or not people truly comply with a standard at any level, consortia all the way up to international, becomes an enormous part of the debate at any given time. So I'm going to open the question.
Yeah, let me go ahead and open it up to folks out here who might have any questions, and feel free to share and direct it to any of the participants here. So, yes, please.
I have a question more about the process of negotiation away from the standards. I'm really curious about what happens internally within Microsoft, because that's a whole big chunk of negotiation as well. And I was really curious to hear you say that leadership is not part of the negotiation. So I'm wondering how that ever came about and what has been put in place to kind of enforce that rule, if you will. And then I'm also with that, I'm curious, how does everybody stay informed? If you're talking about sequencing people, how do you manage all this complex information and share with them?
Right. Well, that's a great question. It has come about because of a mix of historical realities, but also an awareness on our part of why we were dysfunctional and how are we getting around that dysfunction. My job is negotiating inside Microsoft, and I try and shield my team as much as possible from a lot of that. So by the time they're engaging with a product team on a given, so let's say I have a cybersecurity expert who's focused on cryptography. I don't want him debating with everybody first, so I make sure that the product team debate is already not finished, but by the time my team is engaged, the value of his time is I'm being much more careful with how he's doing it, and the work that he does is much more relevant to the people on the other side. I wish that I could tell you we have tried probably 5 or 6 iterations of a tool that we have built and rebuilt and designed and redesigned, and nobody uses it. Everybody uses email. It is one of the reoccurring difficulties for me as a manager is, truthfully, tribal knowledge drives so much of the reality that when I lose somebody and their email goes with them or it gets shut down, codification of decisions and whatnot, that's the only thing I've been successful at with our group, is we've created something internally called the Standards Decision Record. It is a single document that has universally now been adopted within Microsoft, thankfully. And all it does is it codifies a decision. Not all the arguments, not all of the debates that led up to it, all the tribal knowledge and technology capability and who the players were and all of the power asymmetries that were considered and all that which gets discussed. It all happens via email. The thing we end up with is an artifact, is a single document that says we made this decision. And then those get filed and we can go back and look those up. Unfortunately, email is the mechanism. And now, video and IM now is very heavily in that. But it's those asynchronous forms of communication rather than formalized tools that allow us to come to those decisions. The other problem that we have, and this is, we do what are called benchmarking sessions with other companies. Most companies spend a lot of time doing this. It's a very worthwhile activity to sit down with other companies saying, how do you guys do standards? And we share actually quite a bit because truthfully, it's a similar problem. There's very little competitive advantage to organizational structures because everybody has to live and work within their own company culture anyway. But we have found a near universal problem of coordination, one hand not knowing what the other is doing. We used to have Microsoft employees showing up to standards bodies and fighting other Microsoft employees in front of everybody else. That was a very common activity. Microsoft has a highly independent culture within each line of business. And in fact, our CEO can very often, Steve will say, oh, you're going to do this. And the product group's like, yeah, no, I'm not. And that's the culture that's allowed us to be successful, but it also means that the guns are out. Everybody's looking at each other very warily, and so we end up talking a lot about the reason the management team is separated from the negotiators is we have to navigate that cultural reality first before we know what the negotiators are trying to accomplish. And when we had them mashed together, we were ineffective. And as I talked about those people going native, now you've got somebody who's trying to do that negotiation who might care more about the standards body than the internal aspects of it. So we've been very deliberate about that separation.
Other questions or comments?
We've answered everything. Fantastic.
I want to just jump on your compliance testing. I mean, I'm familiar with one standard, which is, back a few decades ago, there was a big problem of airplanes crashing into terrain, into ground, and when that solution came up, it started being a consortium and the government involved, whatever. But the company was able to drive what standards were going to be used to show compliance of the black box in the airplane that would prevent that. Was written very specifically that it took a decade for anybody to start unwinding that and changing that, and that was enough to capture 95% market share. So you can influence, sometimes with one smart person, as you said, drive a full process to huge competitive advantage. And we talked about selecting the standard body, Larry, and the assumption I think here is let's select the one that would get everybody the best solution and be fair to all constituents, where a corporation comes in and sometimes they'll say, we want to select this standard body because we can ram this through in 18 months versus 3 years and we'll be first to market and capture 90%. So there's a lot of tension in selecting the body. What's the criteria for selecting the standard body?
And when you talk about particulate and things like that, I think that's where you start to then broach into health and safety.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where my expertise certainly steps away, but I think there's a reason there's an enormous gap in industrial policy and public policy approaches to health and safety versus the voluntary interoperability construct, because I think that those Those factors are just wildly different. There are very few technology standards that Microsoft has where people's lives are on the line.
How do you think about when a standard should change? In other words, is there some insight that comes from all the time you spent on this that says, well, we're not setting standards forever, and it does take a lot of time and people's money to make a standard. Is there some signaling process, some monitoring process in your mind that makes it clear when a standard should change? And ought there to be in each standard a part of the standard that says who should be monitoring what, so that we know when this standard should change? Or even could there be more contingent standards that say this standard assumes these things, and when the following change, we've already written that that's when the standard should change. The needle goes into the red more often. Now, so you could, in a sense, anticipate when and how change should occur and build in that capacity in the setting of the standard in the first place.
Well, complicated question. I would go back to the idea, if we're talking about negotiation, the sequencing of change is a big part of the conversation. There is a formalized discussion in most standards bodies for something called maintenance, which is when does the standard get maintained. Every standard has errors in it. You publish a multi-hundred-page document, it's going to have errors in it. Some of the errors are just spelling mistakes. I mean, it's as simple as that, literally. Or the numbering system got screwed up, and sometimes there are those things that have to get dealt with. But I don't mean to make light of what the point you're trying to get at, which is there are times where, especially in the technology world, where things are iterating so fast that you have to then come back and revisit that technology, and that is a formalized process. Most standards bodies have a mechanism by which maintenance occurs. I think you're actually getting at a much more interesting and harder to deal with question, which is the life cycle, not just changing it, but killing it. Like, when does that standard no longer hit relevance? And that is also a sequencing question in essence. And very often the technical diplomats are looking at work and saying, I want to introduce something because I want this other thing to go away in the marketplace, or I'm trying to achieve a different goal. There are dynamics in particular in the international standard space that may or may not get formalized in the consortia space around what are called contradictions, where you don't, and my interpretation of the contradictions rules are, a standard shouldn't be formed that actually blocks another standard from working. But standards that compete with each other certainly can be both formulated at the same time. Right? It's, in my mind, not heresy to have two things that are competing with each other, but it is a problem if I literally formed a standard that said, you know, if you run this on the wire at the same time, that whole other system just falls apart, can't run. That would be, in my mind, then that's bad. You shouldn't have truly contradictory actions in that way. But I don't think that there's a way to build in logic, as it were, to the process or the standards themselves that would have a life cycle piece.
Let me
just take a question.
Very interesting. Thank you for your talk. I was curious about how you develop a diverse team of technical diplomats. How do you test for what you believe are critical skills? And then I guess a counsel to that is, when you have a diverse team, then how do you make sure that everyone kind of gets along? I mean, diversity is great because it can create innovation, but then sometimes it's hard to get along day to day.
Right. I have 15 cultures represented in my team.
Okay.
And when we hired them, going through the process was very much not only, I mean, certain countries have rules. The United States does not, interestingly enough. You don't have to be born in the United States to represent the United States in a standards body at the international level. Whereas if you are on the Chinese delegation, you're not being born anywhere else but China. And in fact, you're Han Chinese, right? So you have, there are other, issues that come up. I think that that would be an informal rule. Managing diversity is something that takes quite a bit of effort to make sure that you are recognizing all of the challenges. My Asian employees don't like speaking at meetings in front of everybody else unless they have been very specifically invited to, and they're prepared and they can do it. And then you get into the concepts of face, giving face, taking away face, sharing, all these different elements that drive their cultural. Confucian-based societies have a very different approach to the group dynamics. All of those things have to come into consideration running a team like that. But in terms of assessing it, the first thing I had to do was think through, and for the diversity itself in particular, was I built a matrix of diverse elements that I was looking for, and I realized I wasn't going to get 100% in any one job. And so therefore I was looking to fill all the different Lego blocks to make up the picture that we felt needed to get made up. That's just a function of being deliberate, in the thought. We had, during our negotiation training, Josh proposed having a discussion about negotiating with different cultures. And at first I thought it was going to be, I love the diversity topic, but I thought, well, okay, I don't know if it's going to be a big thing. It went on for an hour, right? It was supposed to be a half an hour, it went on for an hour, and we went around the room and everybody said, and the question that Josh asked was, if somebody's negotiating with you and your culture, what should they know? It was a fascinating conversation. I've been working with these people for 5 years, and things were coming out that I had never heard about. I'll give the Canadian one was interesting to me, which was, don't ever assume a Canadian's an American. And that's a ha, but he said, no, you will fail in your negotiation, be less successful in your negotiation because you will have put them in a position where they're hostile to you right off the bat. Different cultures think of, in a negotiation, what is said at the table versus away from the table. The Chinese, for example, believe that you don't, the less specificity in a negotiation, the better, because then it gives both parties the ability to be flexible later, whereas the Americans want more being clear in the meeting, than not. And each culture was so different, and so having that conversation has actually spurred additional conversations, because when we go into a forum where there's 30 or 40 countries at the table, we are now far more aware, say, oh, the delegate from, so-and-so is speaking. If I'm going to engage them, do I engage it here in the meeting? If I challenge the Japanese guy openly, he's going to feel very different about it than the American, who would love that engagement, right? And so maybe a private conversation with the Japanese delegation versus the German delegation will actually net much better results. So that's a big thing. You may have
I'm just curious, you're talking about competencies and wondering about how you sort of factor in negotiation competencies when you're thinking about bringing people into the team. Is it something you've done in the past?
No.
Is it something you're going to be doing going forward? And how might you...
Is that a good answer for the teacher? I give the teacher the right answer, yeah? No, but yes. The truth is, for me, I'm more aware of it now and would be far more inclined in an interview now to spend some time on pulling out of somebody their awareness and negotiating capability than I would have in the past.
Well, it's also interesting to think about how you would evaluate their negotiation competence in light of their performance, as opposed to just talking with them to try to get at their analytic sensibility with regard to it. And there are some companies that are now including in performance reviews review of negotiation performance, and you need to get everybody square about that beforehand. You need to know what you need to document during the preparation and during the subsequent negotiation in order to fairly give people feedback about and evaluate their negotiation performance.
Right, because there's an interesting question of what constitutes success for somebody in that realm, right? It's clearly not an agreement solely. There's lots of kind of moving parts, right? And you were saying before that in some contexts, it's clearly understood that that Microsoft's not going to get what they want in this way. And even if they know beforehand that that's the case, that this isn't going to happen this time, people are a little more accepting of that. It's sort of like the analogy you used was sort of the whip in Congress, where they go around and check votes and find out where do we stand here. And so there's that feeds into this question. So how would you actually get a sense of whether this person did a good job in that context?
The other thing is, I love the idea. So yes, I need to do hiring. It actually becomes a factor. In our performance review system, negotiation skills aren't called out particularly, but should be. But how you write that would matter a great deal, because my best negotiator, this guy, Jim McPhee, he spent some time with on the phone, Jim will say almost nothing in the meeting. Everybody around the room is saying what Jim wants, because he is the master of setting up the meeting before the meeting ever happens. And Jim will just sit there very quietly, just very silent in the meeting, very smiling. Occasionally he'll read, I have a point, just this one little point, and sort of redirect things. And then 6 people are saying the stuff that he wants them to say. They don't even realize that the strings are being pulled, because he's so gentle about it. And so I would rate him extraordinarily high on the negotiating skill, but it certainly wouldn't be because in a meeting he can be, forceful. Whereas I have other people who are really good at taking a situation that's falling off a cliff in the room at the table, and they can think on their feet, and they can really, so how you would write that, it would be very, I think it's a really tough, both management and negotiation evaluation discussion.
And a lot of it has to do with what you tell people you're going to assess, and how you're going to measure that, because then everybody's aware that that's what you're looking at. Some people believe you need 360-degree evaluation to assess performance, so that it would not just be the manager evaluating these folks, it would be the other people on the team, and even people from other teams, if you can find a way to do that.
I think most larger corporations, review systems that I've talked to people about go through a mix of manager, peer,
right,
associate peer, and even outside of the company.
But relative to negotiation, there's only a very small number of places I've been able to find that they know how to do this for other competences, but they really need to do it. If you want to improve the way your organization negotiates, it isn't going to happen by accident. And training as an input isn't going to be enough. And so with the same care that goes into organizationally assessing all these other competences in that kind of triangular fashion, has to, in my view, has to go also into assessing and building negotiation competence as an organizational competence.
I agree.
I have time for one more last question, if anyone's got one. Yes, Susan.
Oh, it's just a point on one of your slides, when you were talking about managing negotiators, and you said seek diversity, engineer culture versus diplomats culture, and then you said anchor the work, and I didn't know exactly what you meant.
You don't want to ask about the magic elf?
Yeah, let's circle back to that.
So when I think of anchoring the work, it's the negotiator's work must be anchored against product group requirement, always. So I'm from a product company. If I was a State Department negotiator living in Argentina, and working with Matusow or with CTEL or one of the regional organizations there, one of the biggest challenges, and I actually think about the State Department model quite a bit, is how do you make sure that these people who are so far flung, who don't have the day-to-day hallway interactions and access to the sort of the more casual culture that might help drive awareness of a sort of thinking, not a requirement, but what's the thinking behind the requirement? How do you get that flow of information to be right? So the anchoring piece is something that I think is the management team's role very, very heavily, is to constantly, and I think this gets back to your question a moment ago about the information flow. It's a mechanism of not only readiness, but the awareness all the way back through to the people who are driving the requirement as well, and really putting it in front of them. Standards is one of these conversations where you get in front of a product executive, a guy who's got a P&L and he's trying to get everything done, and then you say, you want to talk about standards? And they're like, no, I don't. But you have to bring it up and put it in their face. And one of my colleagues talks about the controlled I told you so process. Right? We see an analysis, we think this is coming, they don't do it, there's pain. At that moment, you got to whack the dog on the nose the right way at the right time, so that the work of those negotiators is not heading off in their own direction. One of the biggest fears that I have of negotiators at all times is that they're taking personal liberties with decisions that can have real implications that they don't see, because they don't have the context that somebody back in the product group might have to say, well, I think it's great that you're talking about, data protection and you want to control in the world of privacy right now, one of the big debates is around something called the right to be forgotten. Can I say to Facebook, forget me? Not only do I want to lose my account, I want you to forget me. They can't. Microsoft can't. Apple can't. We're all tied into these systems. None of the systems are built to actually...
Can't or won't?
No, it's not a won't. It's a can't. The engineering data, the log files, the sharing of information to other... So your photo that you post on Facebook that your friend re-photos or retweets, once it retweets or redoes anything, it's no longer your data. It's now their data. Like, what would it even mean? It's not about won't, it's about a can't. Because the systems are designed to have the information flow in a certain direction, and unflowing it doesn't exist. Well, so let's say that I have a negotiator who's sitting in the room and somebody from the government of Germany, because Germany on privacy is super strong, you must forget, and that person needs to get something done, says, I agree, I think we should be able to write that in. And now I got a product guy going, stop, don't do that. That is where it's not a function even of revenue or something else. It literally does that negotiator know enough and have enough context to be anchored in his or her work so that those decisions that come up, they can make those subtle changes of direction and know what he or she can give up. And in a consensus-based process, you're always forced to give up certain things. But where do you hold the line and where you do not is a function of anchoring, in my mind.
Great. Well, I just want to take a minute to thank everybody for coming. Thank Jason for coming all the way from the West Coast. Lily and Larry, I appreciate your time, effort, and great comments. And thank you all for coming very much.